Hi, everyone. Welcome back to What They Don't Say. Today's conversation is with Aaron Stone. Aaron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Aaron is a survivor, he's a veteran, and he is somebody who has spent years openly speaking about rape, shame, and the silence that often surrounds male survivors. And now every episode I record is important to me. But this one is feeling a little extra important because while I've had conversations about male survivors before, this is actually the first time I'm sitting down for a full interview centered on a male's lived experience of sexual assault. And I know that that gap of who we hear from and who we don't hear from can really shape how we feel about when people come forward or perceptions of survivors of different experiences. Aaron was sexually assaulted when he was 15 years old by somebody who was much older than him. But before we get into everything that followed, I want to slow down and give listeners a chance to actually meet you, Aaron, as a person outside of your sexual assault experience. Aaron, could you take us back to your life at 15 years old? What did the world look like at that time for you? And who was Aaron Stone before your assault?
Well, first, let me take you back to way before I was 15, back to the 80s, back to way before you were born. Um, Sadly, like most couples in the 80s, my parents divorced when I was 5 years old. And so it left my mom, myself, and I had a younger brother and younger sister. So now my mom was a single mother with three kids under the age of five. But thankfully, her parents, my maternal grandparents, lived just down the street. So I'm sorry. So yeah, that's it. Her parents, my maternal grandparents, lived just down the street, and they took me in to kind of help alleviate some of the burden off my mom. They were always there for her. So my grandfather became my father basically. And going back to my father, I have not seen him since I was 5 years old. So if I saw him on the street today, I wouldn't know who he was. But I always call him one of my greatest teachers because he taught me what not to do as a human being and definitely what not to do as a father. I now
Absolutely.
have a 19-year-old daughter who's in college now, and she's the world to me, and I cannot fathom ever leaving her, especially so early in her life, and then having nothing to do with her. And so my grandfather became my dad basically, and for the short 13 years that I knew him, he helped mold me into the man I am today. North Carolina, where I'm originally from, we have a staple called Krispy Kreme
Oh,
donuts. I don't know if you know about
oh my
that.
gosh. Aaron, boy,
Oh,
do I know about Krispy Kreme. Best donut out there, I think.
we would go to Krispy Kreme every single night. He'd get his 35-cent cup of coffee and smoke and joke with his friends. This was back in the 80s where people actually smoked inside buildings.
The good
And
days.
I'd have a chocolate cream filled donut in either a chocolate milk or a Pepsi. And this is every night. But how I didn't become morbidly obese or develop type 2 diabetes, I'll never know. But of course, this was before video games and screens came into play. So in the morning, especially during the summer, our parents would kick us out and literally say, "Do not come home until the street lights are on." So it's funny now because I hear kids say, "Is there really you guys were out and about and no one knew where you were?" Yes, no one knew where we were.
It's
We were
funny because, like,
latchkey kids.
kids today, I think, dream about that, of being able to just like go and their parents have no idea where they were. But in reality, it,
Yeah,
it feels so scary
it
to think
is.
about that now.
And there were even commercials that came on like 10 p.m. of literally remind, "Do you know where your children are?" They had to remind our parents to look around to make sure that we were at home at 10 p.m.
My goodness.
And so that's what we would do every day. And he was the world to me. And sadly, he had been a smoker since he was a teenager, grew up during the Depression. And, cancer was inevitable. And so it did take him in early 1990. So, of course, this left the hole in my heart. I mean, my mom and my grandmother were doing an excellent job of raising the three of us. But of course, at that time, I'm 13, going on 14, looking for that male role model, that mentor, someone to look up to. And then in 1991, when I was 14, I was about to start high school. I got a job that summer at a restaurant called the China Inn. This little bitty Chinese restaurant. I was a waiter. I made a whopping $4 an hour plus tips, but that was a lot to me because I grew up. We did not have a lot of money growing up, and so having that coin in my pocket was independence to me. And it was there that I met a teacher, Mr. Richard Pate. He wasn't at my school, but he was in the school system. He was a middle school science teacher. And by the time that I met him, he had been teaching for well over 2.5 decades. It's not only teaching the current students, but he taught most of their parents. And he was a staple in the community. Everyone knew and loved him. And as many great teachers do, especially those who teach that demographic, kids gravitated towards him, and I was no different. He would show up at the restaurant when I worked on Friday nights, Saturday afternoons for lunch. And if I was on break, if we had, a lull in business, we'd sit down and talk. I just gravitated towards him because he showed a genuine interest in me. We talk about everything under the sun, movies, books, the meaning of life, music, whatever. And for the year that I knew him, nothing inappropriate ever happened. I'd even started going to his house. He wasn't married, and he sit in one chair, I sit in the other, and we would just talk. And that's what our relationship was. This was my friend, my mentor, my father figure that I had. And, I was when you asked me what I was like at 15, I was that this is when grunge was just starting out, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam were hitting it big. So I was that grunge kid. I was already a rock kid to begin with. I lived constantly on a diet of MTV. This is when they actually showed music back in the day.
Incredible.
And, I was that kid wearing, the flannel, had the long hair going over my eye. Uh, I wasn't a very social person. I spent a lot of time working when I was at school. I was in JROTC in high school. I loved it, and that's what developed my love of the military, which I would eventually join after high school. Basically, I was that easygoing kid. I had great, 2 or 3 great friends that I was with. My mom was working night shifts most of the time, so I didn't get to see her a lot, but we had a pretty close relationship. And so but, just like most parents then, they didn't know what most of us were getting into. So she had no idea, who Mr. Pate was or, who he is. And so he was basically my adult figure for that year.
Right. Right. It sounds like you had said that he was sort of a friend and a mentor and you didn't have that strong male figure at home. And so I feel like it's very natural to gravitate towards somebody who was giving you that genuine interest like you mentioned and just like pouring time and energy into you and you felt safe with him. And I'm sure that if he had come up in conversation with your mother, you might have felt completely fine bringing him up then too. And so it makes sense that you would gravitated towards him.
Yes, like I said, nothing inappropriate ever happened. He was the greatest man that I knew. He took me under his wing, and I learned quite a bit from him.
How did this relationship shift from that friendly mentor, almost father-like figure into something that was very dangerous and you were taken advantage of?
The shift was instant. It was fast forward now to August of 92, 24 August of 92 to be exact. I knew him for a year at that point, and that morning it was right before school started for my sophomore year, and I rode my bike to his house as I've done countless times before. I didn't have a license at the time, so I rode my bike everywhere. And I went to his house that morning, started off as we always did. I'm in my chair, he's in his, we're talking, and he said, "I have a cassette to show you in the back." And I think what I forgot to mention that he had a little like man cave in the back of like his music and radio. And looking back on the year that I knew him, there were red flags there, but obviously I didn't see them at the time. But looking back now, I saw that his likes and dislikes began to closely parallel that of a 14, 15-year-old kid. I'm a little bit older now than he was then, and I can't stand what kids are listening to these days. So I don't understand how he could do the same. But he said that he had a cassette to show me, and I went back there as I'd done countless times before. And I don't know if it was something that he planned or something that happened spur of the moment, but he raped me. And I know we like to use as a society sexual assault, which is a plethora of terms from one end of the spectrum to the other. But I like to use the word rape because it is a dirty, nasty, filthy 4-letter word. It leaves nothing ambiguous. Rape is chaos, rape is pain, and rape is humiliation. And rape will take one's humanity to it's almost impossible to regain. And I'm not a big person to begin with, and so not only was I in shock at what was going on, I was just in fear for my life. So I just want to get there alive. Everyone knows about fight or flight, but there's also a little known third F, which is freeze. So think of it as deer in the headlights. The body recognizes that it's not going to be able to fight or possibly not even survive the situation, so it freezes. And that's what happened to me that day. I froze. I simply wanted to survive. I didn't know if he had a weapon. I didn't know if he would hurt or do something worse with me at the end. So it happened. And I couldn't tell you how long it lasted. I stumbled onto the porch, obviously in shock at what just happened, and got on my bike and went home. And I've heard countless survivor stories throughout the years. And one common factor that I've noticed is that many survivors do not remember the details of their attack. The brain shuts down, it protects the body basically. And I bring that up because I was the opposite. I remember every detail of that attack. Like I said, I don't know how long it lasted, but every painful thrust, grab, groan, I is still implanted in my head. But what I don't remember is how I got home afterwards.
Mm.
After I got on my bicycle, next thing I know, I'm standing on my own front porch. This was probably about 10 miles between his house and mine. And how I didn't hit a tree, get hit by a car, I don't know, but I did make it home safe. And the next thing I remember, my hand is shaking, trying to put the key into the doorknob so I can get into the house. I went straight to my bedroom. I curled up. And that day, shame became my main motivator. And even though I had not seen him since then, he held that power over me for so long. A couple days later, I received a letter in the mail. This was still back in the day where you actually put pen to paper, stamp on an envelope.
What's a
And it
letter?
was, and yes, and it was an apology letter. And even though it didn't state anything specific, you could tell something inappropriate had happened between not only this adult and this minor, but a teacher and a student within the school system. I read it once, wanted nothing obviously to do with the man anymore, and promptly threw it away. And I didn't tear it up. I simply threw it on top of the trash can. And my mom approached me with this letter a couple hours later. She had found it. And she was a nurse at a behavioral health facility for troubled teens. And so it was pretty common for her to come home from her night shift, scratches and bruises and whatnot. And she knew something was going on. And she asked me directly, "Did he touch you inappropriately in any way?" And like I said, shame was my main motivator from that moment on. And I told my first lie to my own mother. I said, "No, he didn't touch me. We simply got into an argument." And that was that. And that's what he was apologizing for. And she didn't bring it up again. And I thought that was the end of it until 2 decades later, which I'm sure we'll eventually get to about that.
Yes, and I know that no matter how many times you share your story, it's uncomfortable. It brings up a lot of feelings, and so I'm really appreciative that you're able to share all of that with us. I'm curious, so when you received this letter, what did that feel like? Obviously, you wanted nothing to do with him, but did you feel like oh, something did happen? Just talk to me about what that was like for you.
To me, honestly, it was almost like a taunt because he knew that I wasn't gonna say anything. Who's gonna believe the word of a 15-year-old kid to this teacher, this pillar of the community, this person who has impacted so many lives in a positive way? And like I said, he held that power over me and he knew I wasn't gonna say anything. And it was almost as if, this what happened. I'm going to admit it, but not admit it at the same time, if that makes sense, as if, it'll make it go away. And I didn't see him anymore after that. He stopped showing up at the restaurant. He knew what he did was wrong, but he still had held those strings over me even after so much time had passed. But yes, I did see that as kind of, well, this happened, but I know you're not going to do anything about it.
And I wonder for him too, it almost sounds like he can say to himself, "Oh, I apologized," or not apologized, but he admitted it to some degree, and so maybe it clears his conscience in a way, and he can move on with his life.
Yeah, I also saw it that way also. I was like, yes, okay, well, I did something wrong. Here's my half-hearted apology. But also with me growing up, not only as an American male, but as an American Southern male, we're taught inadvertently that, if another man lays his hands on you and you can't protect yourself, you keep that to yourself. You put those emotions deep down inside because if you cannot protect yourself, how can you be expected to take care of your family or those under your charge? You're not a real man. And sadly, even now, we're still taught that, in society. And that's why we still frown upon, investigating or even researching, or even looking into male on male sexual assault. Because apparently, because you're a man, you let that happen to you, you must have wanted it. And so, you begin to have these doubts going on. And I'm wondering to myself, I'm questioning my sexuality. I'm questioning, did I want it, which is why I let it happen. I'm questioning, Is this cycle could continue, and will I become a predator just like he did?
right? Which is a really honest conversation that I think a lot of us maybe have with ourselves but are afraid to say. A lot of people sort of, I like to say, like logic, quote unquote, their way out of believing that male on male sexual assault is real. Why do you feel that we've gotten to this place where it's just not even acknowledged at all? And that for people, they might not even believe that it exists.
Basically, it's still that stigma of that toxic masculinity that you're not a man. We still have no definitions of what a woman should be, or what a man should be. And if this happens to you, you are not a man. And now with this, sadly, with this current generation, with this alpha male lingo that's floating around out there, this is what a real man should be. And if this doesn't happen to you, or if this does happen to you, whichever the case may be, then you aren't, or you are what we perceived as a man. And sadly, these kids now, they take that to heart. They take that as, well, this person I look up to, if he says this or that and I don't reach up to those standards, then I'm not what everyone else think what a man should be. And sadly, it's those outside forces. It's not even the parents most of the time. It's just whoever they see, on social media, on the screen, that they're constantly being fed over and over again. And even back in my day, I mean, when I graduated high school in '95, when I joined the military right afterwards, even then, like, as far as behavioral health is concerned, it was a stigma to seek help with behavioral health. You were seen as a detriment to the force, you were seen as a weak link. We always harped on taking care of our physical self, but when it came to our mental self, the gray matter between our ears, you dealt with that on your own. And it wasn't until 2001, 2003, when the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq kicked off, with PTSD on the rise, that stigma slowly began to fall away. But of course, you still had senior leadership that believed that if you sought mental health, that if you went to get help at behavioral health, then you were weak. I mean, honestly, I had that mentality also. I had that mentality for myself and not for my soldiers. So it's like I would recommend, yes, if you need to seek help, please do, but I wouldn't do it for myself
That's
because I
interesting.
still had it ingrained in me that I will not be that weak leader.
Right. And it's so interesting too because now we know that our mental health can greatly impact our physical health, but acknowledging, any sort of mental health struggles means that you have to take time away. Like I always say that if you are an athlete or that you're in some sort of space where you're having to like use your body actively, so also in the military, having to take time away if you have a physical injury is so much more work than just like continuing on and ignoring it. And eventually it will always catch up to you. But so like having to stop and take time, tell a soldier, hey, you can go take some time for your mental health. Not only does it publicly quote unquote look weak because of our perception of what we're supposed to be like as men, but it also takes away from the actual like productivity of the entire thing itself. But things catch up to you, things go south. Getting a little bit ahead of myself, could you talk to me about sort of what happened after you threw that letter away? What happened next? You said that Shane became your motivator. What did that look like in action?
It did, and I was never really an outgoing kid to begin with, but this put me into my shell even more. I became even more introverted. I didn't participate in a lot of, school activities. I worked. I went to school. I did participate in swimming for, a year or so. I was always active in JRTC, but I didn't do a lot of social things, the dances, going to the outings. I just wanted to work, go to school, be home. And I did pretty well in school. I was accepted to North Carolina A&T University and just declined. I wanted to get away for a little bit. So I was like, well, I'll join the military for a few years and then I'll get out and decide what I'll do with my life then. So summer of '95, I signed up to be a combat medic, which was my job for those 4 years, turned to be 27 years. I retired a few years ago. Time went by a little quickly, but I did get a lot of education. I've got a couple master's degrees, and Uncle Sam kept paying, and I kept going. So,
Right. So fair. I would too if I were you.
and I was, I mean, I was a great soldier. I was able to keep my personal and professional life separate very long for a very long time. In the morning, I'm that soldier standing tall outside, ready to go. But at night, I'm that 14, 15-year-old kid in my barracks room, still crying, still wondering, still trying to figure out what happened to me years prior because he still held that sway over me. I didn't turn to drugs or alcohol. What I did was to try to take control of my body was to cut, like my open arms and legs. So when I wore shorts and t-shirt, no one could see. And so that's how I tried to gain control of myself. And no one knew, no one at all. Eventually, I got married. I had a daughter, and life went on. I went to Iraq. I was one of the first units to roll over in early 2003. And as a medic, war kept me busy. But what I witnessed in combat never bothered me as much as what happened that August morning of 1992. I was trained to deal with trauma. I was trained to deal with death. I've seen the best and the worst of mankind in the same situation simultaneously. I have held the hands of soldiers as they breathe their last. I have been the last face that they seen before they passed on. But I was trained to deal with that. Ironically, mental health.
Right.
But the back of my mind was always going back to, that assault, that a rape back in 1992. And in 2010, this is over 17 years after the attack. January of 2010, I am driving down the street one evening after work, and I don't know if it was a sight, a sound, or a smell, but something triggered my mind in such a way to cause me to have a nervous breakdown while driving. I started to cry and shake uncontrollably. I pulled over. My body said, "You can't do this anymore. You need help now." And the next day, I'm enrolled in an outpatient behavioral health facility. And I didn't plan on saying anything that morning. I planned on being that good soldier, putting my head down, pushing through. But that first morning, my counselor, Marv, who looked just almost like Richard Pate, same mannerisms, same size, but I always called him the anti-Pate because he was using his powers of persuasion and getting people to open up for good. And that morning, I told my story for the first time to a group of about 14 or 15 strangers.
Wow.
And as cliche as it sounds, the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. I had finally taken that first step towards recovery. I had finally broke free of the chains of shame that this man had me locked in for over 17 years.
Wow. Wow. I really want to emphasize what you said about how you had seen these horrible things while at war and being a part of the military, and that nothing compared to when you were raped. And if that doesn't speak to the depth of damage and pain that rape causes, then I don't know what does. But I think that it's really hard to put into words. So thank you for saying that. Did your wife know that you went to an inpatient program or outpatient program?
Yes, in fact, she didn't know what happened to me initially. I didn't tell her. That was still that much of a coward. That shame was still there. But she found out the night before I told her what had happened, and so that next day, she was very supportive. And so, for the 2 weeks I was there, she knew what was going on, and she finally knew what had happened. That shame was still that major motivator until that day. Like I said, I was able to keep that life very separate. I was able to keep that secret very well.
That's really interesting. So I'm thinking about this sort of like role of shame in your life, and I've had a lot of male listeners write in about their sexual assault experiences. And one of the biggest themes for them as well is, shame. It's shame about not fighting back, shame about not stopping it, shame about not telling anyone, while also fearing that if they do tell somebody, people might question their sexuality or their strength. So, how did you eventually deal with that shame and make sense of sort of that impossible double bind that men experience about having to be strong while also experience the shame? Because it sounds like you sort of hit a breaking point, but eventually you worked through that shame.
One of the biggest ways I was able to, start to finally get out of that cocoon of shame was basically figuring out what I can do to get them off the street. I finished the program. It was only a couple weeks long. And a couple months after I finished, this was around March of 2010, I decided to research the statute of limitations for statutory rape in North Carolina. And it turns out, I don't know what it is now, but back then there were none. And even though I had no proof, it was 17 and a half years after the fact. It'd be my word against this pillar of the community, I decided to call the local police back in my hometown and told them what happened. They took in my story. They said, I was stationed in Alabama at the time, and they said, "Can you come up to North Carolina, give us a written statement? We'll go from there." So I took a few days. I drove up by myself. I gave him a written statement and even showed them where he lived. He was still there. I forgot to mention that not only was he, a teacher, but he only lived, less than a half a mile from the school that he taught. So, these kids were still walking past his house twice a day during the school year. They thanked me for my story. They said, "If something comes up, we'll let you know." But I wasn't expecting anything. But at least I had done something I thought that most people probably wouldn't do. Even though nothing would come out of it, at least I did my part and finally reported and did something about it. And I think it was 5 days later, I received a phone call, and he was sitting in the local county jail under $500,000 secure bond for taking indecent liberties with a minor and for statutory rape. Because it turned out that during the course of their investigation, they were able to access his teaching file through their retired superintendent, and in that file was the letter that he wrote me. It turned out that my mom, after she approached me with this letter, she went to the school board like right after, and this is way back still in 1992. And she showed him this letter. They showed the school board the letter, and like I said, even though it didn't mention anything specific about the attack, some you could tell something inappropriate was going on between this teacher and the student, and the dates on that letter corroborated with the dates that I gave the detectives. And so they had enough evidence to put him away. And what I also didn't know that when she went to the school board, they called him to the carpet per se and gave him the options to retire quietly or be fired publicly. And he took the former. So this whole time I thought he had been teaching, he wasn't. And I had no idea. My mom, who this brave woman went to bat for her son as any good parent would do and didn't tell me a thing. And by the time I found this out in 2010, she was already on the decline for early onset dementia. But every day I still thank her for what she did because if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't able to put this monster off the street.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good reminder for the parents out there that if you have that gut feeling, which it sounds like your mom certainly had, that something happened, you know, I think it's okay to say something. Like, that's your role as a parent is to protect your child, and I cannot believe the school let him quietly leave, like, that even be an option, because what that screams is, we don't actually give a shit about or about kids. Like, people don't need to know that this guy is unsafe. We just don't want our reputation of a school to be ruined by this one person. And I know institutions, they have this great fear and a great responsibility around, having at least a perception of keeping kids safe, but that's not how you do that.
Back then it was just let's sweep it in the carpet and hope we forget about it. And we're preparing for trial because he initially pled not guilty. So I'm preparing to go on the stand to tell my story in public now for the first time. We were hoping that because there were articles out about what happened, and of course I committed the cardinal sin of the internet, which was read comments, and you see things like why did this person wait so long to say something? If it was me, I would have done something about it. And the articles didn't even say if it was a male or female. It just said a former student. So most people probably assumed because of societal biases that it was a female. But the thing is, you don't know what you're gonna do until you find yourself in that situation. I mean, I probably honestly would have said the same thing and before I had this transformative life event. And
Yeah.
we were hoping, the police and I, that with these stories out, that other students would step up. Because odds are low that I was the only child that he sexually assaulted, that he molested, that he raped through his, 20 to 30-year career as an educator. But see, no one else did. So that tells me a couple things. One, maybe I was the one unlucky one. Maybe, but I think that odds are that with as long as he'd been teaching that I wasn't, and just no one else stood up or no one just knew what was going on. So they sadly still might be out there living in the shame that I did for so long.
To me, that's the more likely option. People at that time didn't even have the words to call what happened to them or what somebody did to them sexual assault. It makes sense why they're not going to feel comfortable coming forward about it later because for them, they still might not have even recognized it. Like, I have friends in my life who clearly describe to me what are, like they've been molested, they've been assaulted as children, and they still don't recognize it, even with some little questions on my end of like, well, it doesn't sound like that was consensual and that person was older than you. And, but even with that, it's hard for them to recognize it. And so I think it makes sense when people don't come forward. And you don't want there to be other people, but at the same time, I think it would be validating for you and helpful for the case if there were other people there. And it is unlikely that you were a one-off thing. He knew what he was doing from what it sounds like. He spent an entire year earning your trust. I'm sure that he knew that you did not have a strong father figure in your life. And if you didn't know it fully outright, it became apparent by how much you were drawn towards him.
Yes, I was the perfect candidate, to be groomed, and I know that's a word that we throw around a lot now, but that is what happened. He knew that, I had that void in my life, and I mean, almost instantaneously filled that void, almost from
Yeah.
day one that I knew him.
Perpetrators are not dumb. I think a lot of times we talk about it like, oh, he didn't know, she didn't know, they were unaware, there was confusion. No, that person knew that you were young. That person knew that you were vulnerable. That person knew that you needed a strong male figure to come into your life. They knew that, your mom wasn't there that much. They knew that you needed a friend. Perpetrators are very good at what they do.
They are, and we grew up teaching our kids and being taught ourselves stranger danger. We have the idea of a perpetrator, that creepy man, hanging in that windowless van down the street from a bar, waiting for a drunk man or a woman to stumble out the street. But it's those that we know. It's those that are our teachers. It's those that wear collars. It's those that wear badges. It's family members. It's those that already have our trust and that power. And they're able to use and abuse that power to the point where, just like me, they know that that child is not going to say a word.
You mentioned, so you're currently preparing for trial. Is that right?
Yes, we were preparing, and eventually he took a plea deal. So he did serve. I mean, he basically died in prison in 2013. And I know we're not supposed to talk ill of the dead, but knowing that this man was 6 feet in a box on the ground, knowing that he could no longer molest my family, he could no longer touch my daughter or assault anyone else's family members, was the second time that the weight of the world was off my shoulder. Now he was just completely gone, and I had did something that I was proud of, which was, even after almost 2 decades, to still take this monster off the street. Obviously, I wish I had done something sooner. That still eats at me at times, but we can't harp on that. We look forward and say, what can I do now to kind of not make up, but what can I do to educate? And so, several years later, I'm stationed in Germany. And in the military, for those that have been in, you know that 95% of armed forces are male. But anytime any saw anything on sexual assault, it was always a female's face. Literature, survivors speaking, it was always male on female. But what about the 95% of the population that isn't being represented? And so I went to my local sexual assault and victim advocate coordinator and said, "Hey, if you want a male face, a male voice, go out there and tell his story, I'll do that." And that's what happened. I started just locally when I was stationed in Germany, and word spread throughout the military through the years that there was this male senior leader who was willing to speak. And when my duties allowed, I'd either travel or speak locally to local organizations. And so just having this, I was a E9, which is the highest enlisted rank before I retired, a command sergeant major. And to see this senior enlisted leader speak, for example, to these new privates that are coming in, these 17, 18, 19-year-old kids, and that this senior leader's been in the army for 20 plus years, can get out in front of you and say something and say that, I'm not ashamed of this anymore. You are not alone. You can get help. Knowing that, because just like me, a lot of them come in carrying that weight of sexual assault, that weight of what happened to them as a childhood. Because more, yes, it happens in the military, sadly, more frequently than it should, but a lot of them carry that with them also. It was important to me to be that educator. I'm stationed in San Antonio. This was back in 2017, 2018. And I had a senior non-commissioned officer. He was an instructor in my organization. Basically, my organization, we trained future medical officers, so doctors, physician assistants, nurses, physical therapists, things of that nature. and he was an instructor. And as I always do when I get to an organization, I told my story, and he'd heard it. One day, he was seeking help with behavior health. My commander and I, we didn't know why. We didn't pry like that, but we made sure we gave him the latitude to ensure that he knew that it's okay. Seek the help that you need, please. We'll take care of you. And one day, we don't know what happened. He just kind of snapped inside the office and kind of destroyed office equipment. And the military police brought him to the office, brought him to my commander, and my commander was ready to lay into him. And I said, "Let me talk to him for a second. Let me give me a few minutes alone." So I brought him into my office. I set him down. What's going on? Because he heard me talk, he said, "You know what? I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone because I heard your story. That 20 years prior, when he first joined the military, he was sodomized with a broomstick through initiations and hazing when he arrived at his first of these by these service members who were supposed to be his battle buddies, his new organization. They were of the mindset of, this happened to me, so this is going to happen to you. This is the way it is. Boys will be boys. And this obviously traumatized him, but it ate him up for 20 years. In his eyes, he wasn't a man. He wasn't a real man. He was barely human in his mind. In his mind, he wasn't a good father. He wasn't a good husband, even though the exact opposite was true. No one could tell him otherwise. And we finally got to the root of the problem because even though he was seeing a therapist, he wasn't telling them exactly what was going on. So there was really no really working into what was happening. And
Right.
so from that day forward, he took that first step of recovery. But sadly, the demons in his head were too loud, and even though we thought he was making great progress, a few months later, his daughter had found him at home with a knife in his abdomen. He tried to take his life, and thankfully, she was able to call, 911, get him to the hospital, and as soon as my commander and I found out, we went right away to the hospital, and he was in the emergency room. He was stabilized, he was gonna be okay, and they were going to keep him overnight in the inpatient behavioral health ward for observation. So he could not be in a safer place. And then a few hours later, around 2 a.m., I get a phone call. We all know you get a phone call at that time, it's not good
Never
news.
good.
And it turned out that inside the safest place he could have been in the world, he still found the way to take his own life, and he was gone. What he had done was he took the bandage, the dressings from his abdominal wound, and began to swallow them until he asphyxiated and choked to death when no one was in the room with him.
Wow.
And so he became another statistic. He became that 1 in 22 service members and veterans who take their life daily, and 1 in 300 and I think 25 soldiers in 2018 who took their lives.
And a victim of sexual assault.
Victim of sexual because of that. And that became another reason why I spoke because so many survivors feel that that is the only way out. That there is no help for them, that that no one else will understand the situation that they're in, and they feel that taking their life is the only solution. And I think the greatest part about what I do is receiving a message a week, a month, a year later saying, because of you, I am still here because I was able to get the help that I needed. You gave me the courage to seek help and finally drop those shackles of shame that have been holding me as it did you for so long. And sadly, one of my last duties in that command was to bury that soldier. And even now, on my phone, I have a picture of his grave as a reminder that life is so fragile and perpetrators do not realize how much damage they do to victims, to survivors, how much they can destroy a life for decades simply for a few minutes of power, a few minutes of pleasure, or what a lot of courts have been saying, a few minutes of quote unquote a mistake, which it pisses me off so much.
Yes, rape is not something you accidentally do. It is very much an active choice, and I'm so sorry that you lost this person and that it was heavily due to this shame and the stigma around this and for him not having the resources and the help when he needed it. You mentioned earlier in your story about how, you wish you had said something earlier and you wish you had come forward, but So many times when people do come forward, nothing happens and people aren't believed. And I mean, look at everything that's happening with Jeffrey Epstein. Just came out that somebody reported him in 1996 to the FBI and they did nothing. And so, for you, the most important thing was for your body to go into survival mode and to just keep going. And coming forward about it wasn't even really a real option, I think, at that time. Not to say that if somebody feels like they want to come forward that they shouldn't, but it's just a understanding of giving yourself grace for not coming forward earlier because you were just trying to survive. I'm curious to know that if you could change one leadership behavior, for people who are in charge of young men, whether it be members of a fraternity or sports teams or military environments, what is one behavior that you would change to reduce assaults?
One behavior I always want is for leaders of all levels to create a culture and climate of moral courage, to allow people to speak up. Because you mentioned Jeffrey Epstein, and the last several years, well, almost last decade now, we see survivors speaking up against elected officials. This person did this to me, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And as a society, do we applaud them for speaking up and doing the right thing? No, we put them down. We ostracize them. We tell them to sit down, shut up. Why are you saying something now? And obviously, this sets a precedent for everyone else who wants to stand up and do the right thing. We always harp on doing the hard right over the easy wrong, but yet when someone does, we don't want them rocking the boat. And so when someone else sees this person in front of them trying to do the right thing and they see that their livelihood is destroyed, they don't want that to happen to them. So they keep it to themselves. When people don't speak up, sadly, the truth is never learned. I mean, we talking the other day about the term whistleblower, and we applaud people for telling the truth. I mean, that should not be, the exception where people are telling the truth. But when people do, we put them down, and we as humans are group animals, and we don't want to be left out of the pack. We don't want to be, singled out. We don't want to be thought of as, because if you look at someone standing up with moral courage, because, we look at physical courage, that's easy to see. You see that firefighter running into the building, you see that soldier running across the battlefield. But when it comes to moral courage, that person standing up and doing the right thing, saying this is not right, because moral courage is standing up not only for yourself, but for everyone. And we see that person as trying to make a name for themselves. We see that person as, being a troublemaker, as rocking the boat. And sometimes, sadly, we don't recognize it until years down the road and say, wow, this person was right all along, but we didn't want to believe it because it challenges us to step out of our comfort zone. We don't want people to step out of the status quo. This is the way it is. So we're going to keep it this way because we as adults, we are reluctant to change. Change creates problems. Change creates work that we don't want to deal with. And so that's why you see people, even when they're so wrong, they will dig in deep because they don't want that change to happen, that status quo. And it takes a long time to change a culture. I mean, I have seen a great change in the military since I was in 30 years ago, but it doesn't happen overnight. It's like the Titanic. It's going to take a while to turn. And when I speak, one of the slides I show towards the end is a quote from Socrates. I don't say who it's from. I put up the quote and it says something of the effect like this generation is lazy. This generation, they always want things done their way. They wanted things handed to them. They don't, obey their parents or they don't listen to adults. And I always ask, especially Gen Z, how many of you have heard something about just your generation? Or how many of you have said this about the current generation? Everyone says, yes, yes. And then I say, it's by Socrates 2,400 years ago. And I'm like, it's every generation's God-given right to complain about the current generation because they are making that change. And that's a good thing. Just because it wasn't the way we did it doesn't mean it's the wrong thing. When I joined the military in 95, my first unit, my first platoon sergeant was a crusty old Vietnam veteran from the 70s. And he called me lazy. He called me incompetent because I asked, why are we doing it this way? Why this? Well, I wanted to know why, but that wasn't the way it was done. And so it's great that we seeing these changes being made because that's what we need in this world is change. We need those who are brave enough to step up and say, this isn't right. I'm standing up not only for myself, for that one person that was wrong, that no one will believe but me. So I ask of all leaders, just make that culture and climate of having people come to you, not being afraid. If you are that leader that when someone sees you and they run away because they think something bad's going to happen because all that happens when they see you, you're not an effective leader. Make yourself out there. Do not lead from behind the desk. Get out into the field, get out into the motor pools, get out and eat with your subordinates. They will talk to you, but you have to make yourself available. You have to make yourself attainable, and you have to make yourself to the point where your subordinates, your employees are not afraid to speak to you, to tell the truth.
So would you say that it's even more than directly talking about sexual assault or these super vulnerable things? It's more about just creating a space where somebody would feel comfortable to bring that up. So it's like forming a real relationship with them. Is that
It
what you
is.
would
I
say?
mean, if your subordinates are afraid to speak to you about little mundane things, they're definitely not going to bring up something as big as sexual assault because that trust isn't there. And you may say, we have these written policies in effect that's going to do this and this and this, but your actions speak so much louder than words. And if your actions show otherwise, they see that because as a leader, you are in that fishbowl. All eyes are on you, and everything that you do is seen. And if you lose that trust, it is so hard to get that back.
As a leader, you carve that new path for other leaders to follow in to make it a safe space for people to talk to you. When you think about your 15-year-old self, or even the versions of you after your 15-year-old self, where you carried that weight alone for so many years, what's one thing you would say to that 15-year-old you and that version of you that had to carry so much of that weight for so long?
That it will be okay. Honestly, I wouldn't change anything that happened to me because I have learned so much on this journey. Obviously, I hate that it did, and obviously, I hate that it happens too often. But I would say that it's going to hurt for a very long time, but it will make you strong. You will learn from this. And because of this, you will be that educator. You will be the one that's out there ensuring and hoping to prevent others from going through the same thing. And if they have, I can't change that. But what I can do is ensure that they know that help is out there. They are not alone, that there's someone always willing to lend an ear, to lend a hand, that we are out there to help you. And you never, ever have to walk that path by yourself.
Absolutely. Aaron, thank you so much for being here. If people want to have you speak or if people want to reach out to you, what is the best way for them to contact you and find you?
The best way is going through my website, which is 18winters.com. It's literally the numbers 18winters.com. All my contact information is right there, and also through the socials also. So that's the best way to reach me.
Amazing. Aaron, thank you for all that you do for male survivors and other survivors of sexual assault and rape. Thank you for serving our country. Thank you for speaking about this and for creating space for this in spaces that this conversation is not currently being had in. I'm so grateful that you're here today. And to all the What They Don't Say listeners, thank you guys for being here. If you want to follow us on social media, if you want to send us a message, go to whattheydon'tsay.com. I will see you next week. I'll catch you on the flip side and cheers.
Cheers.